The Young and the Restless spoilers shock. Mariah had always been the kind of woman who wore strength like armor. Who smiled through the ache in her chest and pretended that all was well even when her soul was fraying at the edges. But strength, as it turns out, is not an endless resource. And somewhere along the line, after the loneliness, the pressure, the whispers of judgment that clung to her like smoke, Mariah cracked. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't visible to most. But something inside her broke in silence, and she began to withdraw, not just from the world but from the one person who had always been her sanctuary. Tessa had noticed the change, the distance. The way Mariah would flinch when she reached out. She had begged, pleaded, tried to hold her wife close, but Mariah had shut down, retreating into a shell of silence and avoidance. She had pushed Tessa away not because she didn't love her, but because she couldn't bear to let anyone see what was happening beneath the surface. And so, she carried her pain alone. Hidden behind tired eyes and forced smiles, dragging herself through the days as if survival were a punishment. When Mariah disappeared without warning, the worry spread like wildfire through Genoa City. Calls went unanswered. Her apartment sat dark and untouched. Even Sharon, whose maternal instincts had always been frighteningly accurate, couldn't reach her daughter. People speculated. Perhaps she needed space. Perhaps she had gone on a retreat. But deep down, those who loved her knew something wasn't right. And then came the moment that turned whispers into gasps, the shocking sight of Mariah, alone and pale, standing at the grand entrance of Cain Ashby's extravagant Parisian soirée. The room, filled with elegance and power, froze. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead, music died mid-note, and every eye turned to the young woman whose mere presence was a scream in the silence. Sharon and Nick had flown in for the event, hoping to gather intel on Cain's rising influence in the European corporate scene. They hadn't expected this. When Sharon spotted her daughter, her heart stopped. She clutched Nick's arm, her voice shaking as she whispered in disbelief, "Mariah? What are you doing here?" The girl they once knew, now visibly trembling and barely holding herself together, stepped forward, eyes wide and glassy, the weight of her truth heavy in every footstep. "I had to come," Mariah said through clenched teeth, her voice cracking as she faced the sea of power brokers and socialites. "I had to show you all who this man really is." And then she turned to Cain. The man stood near the center of the room, calm and calculating as always, surrounded by associates and pawns in tailored suits. But his mask faltered when Mariah reached into her coat and pulled out a crumpled envelope, an envelope that had been folded and unfolded so many times it bore the wrinkles of desperation. She walked toward him slowly, her other hand wrapped protectively over her stomach, and as she stood inches away from him, she hurled the contents of the envelope in his face. DNA results. Printed in bold, undeniable letters. The name Cain Ashby. And beneath it, the title that turned the world upside down, biological father. Gasps rippled through the room like thunder. Cain staggered backward, color draining from his face. "This is insane," he hissed, shaking his head. "This is a setup. A lie. I don't know what game you're playing, Mariah." But she cut him off with a scream so raw it silenced him. "You know exactly what you did to me," she sobbed, trembling now as Sharon rushed forward but stopped short, sensing her daughter's need to speak. "You used me. You manipulated me when I was vulnerable. You brought me to Paris under the pretense of a career opportunity, and then you isolated me, coerced me. Made me question my sanity. You made me believe I owed you everything. And when I wanted to leave, when I tried to run, you gaslit me, threatened to ruin me. You said no one would believe me." Her voice cracked again, and she wrapped both arms around herself, her frame shaking. "And I believed you. For a while, I really believed you." Sharon's tears had already begun falling, her hands covering her mouth in horror. Nick stepped closer to shield them both from the crowd's gaze, but no one looked away. They were witnessing the unmasking of a man who had long hidden behind charm and calculated charm. Mariah turned to the audience now, to the people who had shaken hands with Cain, done business with him, invited him into their homes. He is not who you think he is. He's not a visionary or a genius. He's a predator. And I won't let him rewrite the truth. She collapsed then, nearly buckling under her own weight, and it was Sharon who finally rushed forward, catching her daughter as her knees gave way. "You're safe now," Sharon whispered, though she wasn't sure the words were true. Nothing felt safe anymore. Cain's world shattered in an instant. Those who had whispered admiration behind his back now exchanged wary glances. His allies took a step back, unsure of whether to defend him or flee. He tried to recover, tried to regain control. "She's unstable," he barked. "This woman has a history of emotional problems. Ask anyone. She's just trying to smear me because..." But Nick stepped forward then, fists clenched. "Enough," he growled, voice low and dangerous. "You've said enough." No one stopped him when he walked straight up to Cain and stared him down. There was fire in his eyes, the fury of a father whose child had been broken. Cain flinched. For once, the master manipulator was at a loss for words. Later, when the crowd dispersed and whispers turned into headlines, Mariah lay in a Paris hospital under Sharon's watchful eye. Tests were run. The pregnancy was real. The trauma was deep. And while the road ahead would be one of lawyers, depositions, and reckoning, Mariah had made a decision. She would not disappear again. She would not let Cain bury this truth like he buried so many others. For too long she had lived in the shadows of stronger personalities, had questioned her own worth, her own voice. But now, with a child growing inside her and the world finally listening, she had found a strength deeper than anger, deeper than fear. She had found purpose. The coming weeks would test her resolve. Cain, desperate to salvage his empire, would launch a counteroffensive. His legal team would attempt to discredit her. Old mistakes would be dragged into the light. Tessa, heartbroken and confused, would fly to Paris, begging to understand what happened and why Mariah pushed her away. And Mariah, now navigating both the emotional wreckage and the responsibility of bringing a life into the world, would have to choose what kind of mother she wanted to be, what kind of legacy she wanted to create. But one thing was certain, the illusion of Cain Ashby's invincibility had been destroyed. Not by shareholders or rivals, but by the courage of one broken woman who refused to be silent anymore. And in that courage, Genoa City would be forever changed. Because from this point forward, every powerful man hiding behind contracts and boardrooms would remember what happened in Paris when a woman named Mariah Copeland walked into a palace of privilege and shattered the illusion with naught but the truth and a single DNA test. And for once, the world didn't look away. Cain had always played the part of the polished mogul well, perfect suits, charming speeches, and a disarming smile that made people question whether the rumors swirling around him could possibly be true. But beneath the surface, behind the closed doors and whispered conversations, there was another side of Cain Ashby, one that operated in shadows, one that saw vulnerability not as something to protect, but something to exploit. And that side of him was about to be dragged out into the light by the last person he ever thought capable, Mariah Copeland. Mariah had been unraveling for months, quietly, painfully, hidden behind the facade of strength she had perfected for years. The pressure of expectations, the guilt of past mistakes, and a trauma so profound she couldn't put it into words had crushed her spirit slowly, until she could no longer recognize herself. She began pulling away from Tessa, the woman she loved more than anything, unable to explain the darkness swallowing her from the inside. She didn't want Tessa to see her broken. She didn't want anyone to see. So, she pushed her away, buried herself in silence, and when it became too much to bear, she disappeared without a word. No phone call. No note. No explanation. Just absence. But absence has weight. And it drew concern from those who loved her, especially Sharon and Nick, who knew their daughter's silence was never a sign of peace. They searched. They worried, but they never expected what would happen next. Paris had always been the city of lights, of dreams and illusions. And on that fateful night, Cain had orchestrated one of the most glamorous events of the season, gathering influencers, CEOs, and global investors to solidify his reputation as a visionary force in international business. But what he didn't know, what no one knew, was that his illusion was seconds away from shattering. The moment Mariah stepped into that ballroom, the air changed. Every head turned. Conversations halted. Even the music hesitated. She looked pale, gaunt, eyes haunted but resolute, as though she had dragged her broken pieces across continents to finally speak her truth. And Cain saw her. His face drained of color. His mind raced, calculating damage control before a single word was spoken. Because he knew. He knew the power she held in that moment. Mariah? Sharon gasped from across the room, gripping Nick's arm with alarm. What is she doing here? Mariah didn't respond. She kept her eyes on Cain, cutting through the crowd like a blade through silk. The man of the hour stood frozen, his glass slipping slightly in his hand. He forced a smile, trying to wave her off, as though her presence could be minimized by social cues. But Mariah didn't stop. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn and crumpled from her grasp. A single ultrasound image. And then another sheet, a DNA test. She held them up. Her voice trembling but clear. You don't get to pretend anymore. Cain's voice cracked, louder than he intended. Don't do this, he hissed. Not here. Not now. You're ruining everything. But Mariah stood tall, her hand protectively cradling her stomach. Then maybe it deserves to be ruined, she snapped back. You ruined me. The silence in the room was absolute. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but no one dared interrupt. Mariah unfolded the DNA test with shaking hands and threw it onto the floor in front of Cain. You did this, she said, voice hoarse. You brought me to Paris under false pretenses, made me think it was a professional opportunity, isolated me, controlled me, and when I tried to leave, you made me doubt myself. And now, she paused. Her other hand still resting on her stomach. Now, I'm carrying your child. Cain's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at the documents on the floor, then at Mariah. Then at the crowd now turning against him. And in that moment of silence, where he said nothing, where his denial didn't come quickly enough, the room drew its own conclusion. His silence spoke volumes. And for a man who had built a career on control, on persuasion, on spinning narratives, silence was his undoing. He eventually found his voice, but it was too late. This is a lie, he stammered. She's unstable. She's always had issues. You all know her history, emotional trauma, hallucinations, paranoia. This is just another breakdown. But no one moved to support him. No one defended him. Mariah, still standing in the center of the room, looked around at the guests. Even if you think I'm crazy, she whispered, the test doesn't lie. The baby growing inside me doesn't lie. Nick stepped forward, fists clenched, ready to pounce if Cain said another word. Sharon held Mariah's shoulders protectively. Eyes wide with horror but also maternal fire. She hadn't known. None of them had. But they knew now. And they would not let Mariah face this war alone. Cain's attempt to pivot failed. Fine. He muttered, his voice venomous. You want to destroy me? Then you'll get what's coming. If you keep pushing, Mariah, I swear I will ruin you. But that only solidified what many already suspected, this wasn't a man being falsely accused. This was a man caught, exposed, and now threatening retaliation. Later that night, as the guests departed in stunned silence and whispers of scandal spread like wildfire across media outlets and corporate channels, Mariah collapsed into a chair in a quiet hospital room. Sharon never left her side. The ultrasound confirmed everything. The pregnancy was real. The DNA test had been verified. Cain was the father. And now the question became, what would she do with this truth? Tessa arrived in Paris days later, her heart torn open by the realization that Mariah had suffered in silence. She wasn't angry. She was devastated. She tried to hold Mariah, to reach her again. But Mariah was still somewhere between trauma and clarity, torn between wanting to reclaim her life and fearing what came next. Could she raise a child born from betrayal? Could she face the world without shame when everyone now saw her as a headline, a victim, a scandal? And Cain? His empire began to crumble. Sponsors pulled out. Investors canceled deals. Journalists dug deeper. Rumors from past assistants, former colleagues, and hushed settlements began to surface. The carefully constructed tower of wealth and deception that Cain had built over the years was falling brick by brick. But he wasn't done fighting. He hired the best attorneys. Tried to paint Mariah as mentally unstable, claimed the encounter was consensual, even fabricated stories of a romantic affair. But the world had changed. People were no longer so willing to believe the man in the suit and discredit the woman who cried out. Mariah, for the first time in a long time, didn't hide. She spoke. In interviews. In court. In therapy. She confronted her pain head-on, and slowly, she began to reclaim her narrative, not as a victim, but as a survivor. She wasn't defined by what Cain did to her. She was defined by what she did after. And the baby she carried wasn't a curse or a shameful secret, it was a life, hers to protect, to love, to raise in a world that now knew the truth. Her strength inspired others. Sharon stood beside her as a mother and a fighter. Tessa held her hand through sleepless nights and painful memories. Even Devon stepped in, offering support and shelter when media attention became too intense. Mariah's story became a movement, not because she asked for it, but because her bravery ignited something in others. As for Cain, his silence in the ballroom that night haunted him. He had underestimated Mariah. He had assumed she would break and disappear. But instead, she rose. And no matter how hard he tried to smear her, the image of her, pregnant, crying, but unflinching, at his own party remained seared in the public consciousness. There would be trials, custody hearings, public fallout. But there would also be healing, growth, and redemption. Mariah, in the end, did not just survive Cain Ashby, she ended him. And from the ashes of his deception, she began again. Let me know if you'd like to continue with Mariah's custody battle, Tessa's emotional journey, or Cain's trial and downfall.